next question. What is the relationship that the forms have to each other? Well, we talked a little bit about this in class. So we start with the particular things. These trees. I see cedar. I don't see one around here, but I think there are oak trees around here. And there's probably even a variety of cedar that are around here too. Well, all of these cedar trees fit under the form of cedar. And the oak fit under the form of oak. Right? And they in turn fit under the form of tree. There's other kinds of plants out here. The camera isn't pointed to them, but I see bushes. I see ivy. I see moss. Right? These all fit under the form of plant. So you got the particulars. You move one up, one form up. That's called a genus. Right? You move another form up. That's another genus. So when you're moving up abstractions, you're moving up with genus or genera. When you move down, so you go from the form of plant down to, say, tree. Right? Tree is a species of plant. We'll try to look at that a little bit more in class, so that's more clear. But as you move up in abstraction, you start grouping things under one. So cedar is a form alongside of oak under the form of tree. Right? And tree is a form alongside ivy and alongside bush. And these are under plant. Right? Well, a form alongside plant would be animal. Yeah? Then plant and animal are under the form of living things. Alongside living things are non-living things. So we got rocks and water and fire and various things like that. So as you're moving up, what we have is a hierarchy. We have higher forms that subsume lower forms. And then finally the lowest form subsumes these particular things. Well, this is the relationship. The forms fit in a hierarchy. And again, following the allegory of the cave, the further up you move in abstraction, the closer you come towards the top form. Now, this is called various things, but true, good, being. This is the form under which everything else is subsumed. And to understand that, you understand everything. Finally, maybe the trickiest question of all is, how do we know about the forms? Now, there's three versions that Plato gives. First, we discussed this in class, is we don't learn about the forms, we remember them. And again, he's appealing to this idea, or he's trying to tease out here, is that it's really impossible, or seems impossible, to learn anything. Because it seems like what we're doing is we're learning or we're knowing from what we don't know. Well, we can't know from what we don't know. Right? Empty thoughts do not produce full thoughts. And the other way to think about it maybe is that we're learning from what we already know. But if we already know it, and what we learned is somehow in what we already know, then why do we know everything to begin with? So Plato, following Socrates here, thinks that we were in contact with the forms before we were born. And he thinks that we have an immortal soul. Now, let's be clear here. He doesn't think that we remember the forms from the belief that we have immortal souls. It goes the other way around. He thinks that the only plausible explanation for how we know the forms is that we must have some kind of immortal soul. And this immortal soul was in contact with the forms through the process of birth, through the trauma of birth. We forgot. And we spend the rest of our lives remembering what we had with the forms. So that's remembering. The second one is through dialectic. In dialectic, we go back and forth and we compare ideas of what forms are, the definitions of things. Now remember, this is this difference between inspection and interpretation we talked about in the last chapter with Socrates. See, the idea is, I think it's related to the first, is that somehow that form is in our mind. And through the process of dialectic, we figure out what that form is. And finally, the third has this really weird phrase where we subtract away from particular things to get to the form. Subtract? What are we subtracting? Remember the cave. What we subtract away from these things to get to the form is appearance. We keep pulling that away until we figure out what is what's really real. What is the universal? What makes these things these things? So we look at these trees and we pull away from them, pull the appearances away from them until finally we have the form. Well, Plato's given us a few curiosities. There are these forms. They're immaterial. They're more real than this thing, even though I can touch and interact with this thing, but I can't touch or interact with the forms. The forms are what causes all of these things. How can immaterial things cause material things? Yeah, it's tough to swallow. But there are certain advantages to Plato's theory. I mean, first of all, he gives us an account of how what we say is in fact true. We talk about this cedar tree, and we talk about that oak tree, and we both say that they are a tree. Well, that a tree, that's a form. It's a universal. If forms don't exist, how could we possibly make sense of this claim? How could it possibly be the case that there's any truth to what I say when these things are both trees? Without universals, all I could talk about is this thing, and all I could talk about is that thing, but I can't ever say that they're trees. So this advantage that Plato gives us with this theory of forms is that now we have objective knowledge. It's not just a figment of our imagination. It's real. You know, on top of that, kind of related, we talk about better and worse all the time. We talk about good and bad all the time. Well, good and bad are not material things. They're not even physical properties. You can't look at a person and see bad. You can't look at a knife and see bad. Right? Now you infer, you judge, you comprehend goodness and badness. You never perceive it. But again, if there's not this form of goodness and badness, how are we making any sense when we talk about goodness and badness? And I don't think you're willing to give that up, because then you're going to say such things like, well, it's neither true nor false that Hitler was a bad guy. Without for the forms, it's hard to see how that makes any sense. So we might be worried about immaterial things, but Plato would probably sit here and remind us, by the way, you're already committed to the existence of immaterial things. You are. We freely talk about in the physical sciences, we freely talk about the laws of nature. Well, the laws of nature govern, describe material things, but they themselves are not made of matter. Otherwise, the laws of nature would govern themselves, and they don't do that. They deal with these things. And if we don't have any kind of immaterial objects whatsoever, that means that the sciences are neither true nor false. They're just figments of our imagination. That seems bad. We're committed to the existence of numbers. Numbers are not material. Without any kind of form of number, all mathematics, purely a fiction. Yeah. And we don't have to go that far. We don't have to go to abstractions. Forces. We talked about this in class. Forces are not made of matter. Forces are not material. They affect matter, but they themselves are not matter. So Plato would say you're already committed to the existence of immaterial things. And when we're dealing with forces, you already got one immaterial thing affecting a material thing. Forces are not made of matter, but they affect material things. So there should be a problem, at least conceptually, talking about an immaterial form causing this thing to exist. That's a lot to take in at once. We'll talk more about it in class.